Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lucinda Broad, and I'm the Community Manager for the Managing Sustainability Working Group here at 2 Degrees, and I'll be your host for this session. I'm delighted to be joined today by Eric Dargent of WWF and Hazel Henderson of Ethical Markets Media, who'll be presenting today. Now, just a few technical points before we kick off. At the end of the presentation, there's going to be some time to address any questions that you might have. And you can submit a question to me at any point by typing in the Q&A box, which you'll find on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So just type in your message and press send, and then we'll address those at the end of the session. And if you have any problems with the technology or the audio during the presentation, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message. From the drop-down menu, just select send the message to the host, and I'll get back to you. I'm now going to hand over to Eric for the first part of today's session. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Lucinda. Welcome, everyone, to this 30th webinar of the One Planet webinar series. Thanks for joining at this slightly unusual time. We usually have webinars a bit earlier in the day, but today we're going to hear from someone calling in from Florida, so we're accommodating time for everyone. I am Eric Dargent from WWF. I am myself calling in from Paris today, in France. This webinar is part of our One Planet Leaders initiative, which is the business education, innovation, and leadership initiative at WWF International. We develop and run programs with some of the world's leading schools, IMD in Switzerland, the University of Exeter in England, and starting this July, and we are really excited about this, the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And we also run in-company customized programs. So for this final webinar of the 2012-2013 series, we are very pleased to welcome Hazel Henderson. From her early days as an environmental activist in the 60s, Hazel has developed into one of the world's most renowned thinkers and doers in sustainability. So she's going to talk us through her journey, her thinking, and present her latest work around the principles of economies and finance based on the principles of nature, of life, which is developed with the Biomimicry 3.8. I will come back after her presentation for a Q&A session, but for now, over to you now, Hazel. Thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. Thanks a lot for your time and for which is an early start for you in Florida. Thanks, Hazel. Over to you.
Me okay? Good, okay. So this is really a pleasure for me, and let's start with fighting this tiger of change that we're all having to do because change is accelerating, as you all know, because of global interactivity and communications and all of the technologies, so from jets and satellites and everything else. And so we now are having to deal with this technological globalization that we all created, and now we have to figure out how to manage it. So after I attended the World Social Forum, the first one in Porto Alegre, Brazil, right after the Battle of Seattle, which took place in 1999, I wrote this book, Beyond Globalization, and I was really looking at all of the alternatives to the conventional economic growth path, which most governments were still promoting, and certainly at the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, and of course most of us who came out of the environmental movement knew that that was a totally unsustainable way to go. And so I realized that it was incredibly important to really emphasis now on cooperation, because there is no way now that we haven't all linked ourselves together. And the new issue, of course, was how to beef up the United Nations, create all kinds of other venues for global treaties on protecting human rights, protecting the environment. And so I had written a book in 1996 called Building a Win-Win World, where I tried to point out the obvious, and that is that countries who, of course, are very concerned about their sovereignty could indeed pool their sovereignty. And the best example of that, of course, is the European Union, which has been an example for people all over the world. So for us individually, as we lead our organizations, the watchword is keep learning and stay flexible. Correct for new information every day. And this is totally different from what many of us were taught. The old business paradigm was that we had to create a business plan and set out very, very carefully what was happening in year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, those rigid business plans were not working, because the world was changing every day. And so that was how gradually we all learned that the model had to be course correct, stay flexible. And so my journey began, I began as an NGO and co-founding an environmental organization in New York City called Citizens for Clean Air. And one thing led to another, and I ended up in the mid-'70s as a science policy wonk. And I have always written books and articles, and I've always thought that media was key, and that one way or another we had to figure out how to express our thoughts, get them out there on all of the different media of communications. So that's been a constant theme in my life. And along the way, I discovered the errors in traditional, conventional economics, which is still taught, in so many business schools. Not the one at Exeter, happy to say, as I'm sure Eric remembers, but most business schools are still are fairly traditional in terms of economics. And, of course, the first thing we looked at Citizens for Clean Air in New York City was, oh, my Lord, we have to correct the GDP, because it was counting all of that pollution in New York City as useful product. And even the efforts to clean up the pollution was added to the GDP as even more useful product. So back in the 60s, we contacted our senator, who at the time was Senator Robert Kennedy. Excuse me. And we took him on a helicopter ride around New York City, showing him all of the sources of pollution. And we explained to him why our program was calling on our government to correct the GDP and subtract things like pollution from the GDP instead of adding it in as useful product. In other words, separating the bads from the goods. And at that time, I came up with a visual showing what a net GDP would look like. So for me, that goes on back a long, long way. And one way and another, I remember pushing that at almost every speech I made, every article I wrote. And I went to the first Earth Summit, which some of you may remember was actually in Stockholm in 1972. And I went there as a reporter. and talked about the whole GDP thing, wrote about it. And then I went to Rio in 1992, and as you know, Article 40 in the Agenda 21 agreement that came out of Rio did commit 170 countries to actually correcting their GDPs. But as you know, subsequently, very little happened. And so we are still dealing with that problem, and we can talk about that more at the end of my talk. So I kept writing articles and one thing and another, and ended up in 1982, I realized that companies really, that of course we were trying to get companies to change and all of that, but that companies were puppets of Wall Street and of finance. And so I decided, after being involved with the Calvert Social Investment Fund, which started in 1982, and I joined their advisory council in 1982, and was there helping them develop screens for corporate performance. And yet I realized that screening portfolios wasn't the total answer, because as long as those people on Wall Street, the security analysts, were constantly pushing companies to more and more growth, and they were using the GDP growth model, we were stuck unless we also went back to the correcting the GDP issue. So correcting the metrics had to go on at both levels, the level of the company and the level of national accounts. And so I had, by that time, written a book about this called Paradigms in Progress, which came out actually in 1991. And I was combing the world for all kinds of alternative indicators. And so that's what that book was about. And as part of that, I developed my own alternative indicators, which I called country futures indicators. And I subsequently got my colleagues at Calvert to work with me on presenting our own quality of life indicators for the USA, which we put up on a website in the year 2000 and said we don't want to use the economic method, of collapsing all of the apples and oranges into one indicator, which is far too highly aggregated. Instead, we said, why don't we put them on a website as a dashboard? We boiled it down to 12 indicators and put them on a website, which back in 2000 was a kind of a fairly unusual thing to do. And we still have those indicators, and we are updating them now, and they're now called the Ethical Markets Quality of Life Indicators. And Calvert has turned that project back to me. So what I have been doing the last few years is looking at all of the new science from many, many different perspectives, which actually invalidates most of the core theories of economics. And, of course, from quantum mechanics, and I'll just go through these very quickly, but you're probably fairly familiar with a lot of these debates that are going on. And particularly from thermodynamics, which I had gotten onto very early and realized, my gosh, the economists don't actually subscribe to the laws of thermodynamics because of the way their model works. It's completely leaves out the issue of the way energy is actually processed on this planet. And then I got very interested in all of the nonlinear mathematics, the chaos models, complexity theory. I got to be friendly with Georgescu-Roygan, who wrote a wonderful book called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. And I discovered that back at the early part of the 19th the 20th century, about, I think it was about 1911, Frederick Soddy, who was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, had come to all the same conclusions that I was coming to in pointing out that economics was simply not based on science at all, but it was all a subjective collection of theories with very, very little validation in the real world. And what I had pointed out in a book I wrote in 1981, looking at a lot of these things, was, for example, that compound interest is simply a mathematical illusion. It doesn't have anything to do with the real world. So the endogenous kind of science that's now going on in psychology, endocrinology, brain science, behavioral research, is all pointing to the same thing, that the conventional economic model that has human nature as being competitive and self-maximizing and rational is all disproven, most recently by the psychologist Kahneman and Tversky. And they won at least Kahneman won the Bank of Sweden Prize, which the Nobel Committee gives out. And basically, of course, this led to the foundation of all of the new behavioral views in economics. I don't like to call it behavioral economics because it's not actually, it's behavioral science. And so more and more we are finding now that those old economic textbooks have to be thrown out. And I have an article which is coming out, well, actually it's kind of a monograph, which is coming out from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales in a few weeks, and which is co-published by Tomorrow's Company, which many of you know, based in London. And I've just gathered up all of this stuff. And what I'm saying in this monograph very clearly is that most of the theorizing in economics, which underpins all of those financial models, which failed so badly, is defunct. But we don't have to worry. We won't be flying blind when we drop all of these models. What we'll go back to is something much more reliable, and that is Earth system science and biomimicry and really understanding how the planet works. So we can talk more about that. So basically, my whole theme since I wrote Politics of the Solar Age in 1981 was looking at this global transition from fossil fuel industrialism to what I call the solar age, which, of course, is very information-rich and cleaner and greener. And it's an extraordinary thing for me to realize how that model of the green economy is now surfacing all over the world, particularly after Rio Plus 20 last year in Rio de Janeiro. And I got onto understanding how the planet works, we might say, from my service at the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment in Washington from 1974 to 1980. I also served on a panel at the National Science Foundation, which was called Research Applied to National Needs. And I also served on a panel at the National Academy of Engineering on public infrastructure. And, of course, in the U.S., we are very much stuck with an obsolete infrastructure based on the automobile and the big electric utilities, nuclear power, and long transmission lines, which waste a lot of energy. And so what I had been pointing out in a lot of the lectures that I did, like in China and places around the world, my message was, please look at the USA and see how we have gotten stuck in our infrastructure. And it's going to be much easier for developing countries to leapfrog the old industrial model and go straight to the solar age. And we see a lot of that discussion now in the world. The word leapfrog is very commonly used as we think about how we apply green economy technologies and how the emerging countries in the South have all these wonderful opportunities to do that leapfrog. And at the same time that all of these discussions were going on, the mainstream media was still talking about the old model. They were still backing into the future, looking through the rearview mirror. And I began to call this commercial censorship, because basically the fossil fuel industries were the ones who paid for the advertisements. So when I founded Ethical Markets Media in 2004, it was because I thought there was no way that the story of this transition to the solar age was ever going to be able to be told by mainstream media. And so we would have to set up another company to do this, and so we did. And we also set up at the same time the Ethic Mark Awards for advertising that uplifts the human spirit in society. And that award is now in its 7th year, and last time it was given in London at the Sustainable Brands Conference, and we were thrilled that 400 or so market executives loved the idea that there's going to be a new role for advertising in the future, which is really helping people toward more satisfying lifestyles, personal development, and a sustainable society. Another thing we do at Ethical Markets Media is we have a series on transforming finance, and if you can go and watch those at ethicalmarkets.tv. And we have been convening progressive asset managers who manage socially responsible mutual funds since 2010. And there's about 20 half-hour shows up there that you can watch where I'm just talking with all of these asset managers. And the latest thing we did was our 3rd survey with GlobeScan on the old GDP theme. And the first one we did was for the European Commission at the Beyond GDP conference in 2007. And we've done 2 more since then. And we find that public opinion in the 11 countries around the world that GlobeScan surveys for us, people understand completely why we have to change GDP and bring in indicators of quality of life, of health and education, poverty gaps, etc., etc. And our TV series as well, we did a TV series based on my book, Ethical Markets, Growing the Green Economy, which came out in 2006. And they are seen on PBS stations in the U.S. And so, let's see, there we go. And then what we are also doing is what we call the Green Transition Scoreboard. And when we realized that the discussions in Copenhagen were going to be a bit of a train wreck on climate change, we decided that we would show how much private money since 2007 has already been committed by, including investors like me, in the new green economy. And so our latest numbers, as you see there, are 4.1 trillion. And if we keep on at that rate, investing approximately $1 trillion a year worldwide in these new green sectors, by 2020, we will have entered the solar age. And so we're very careful to exclude nuclear and coal and CCS and ag-based biofuels. So it really is a green index, and please go to our website and examine it. Give us some feedback. And then we have joined up with the Biomimicry 3.8 company and my friend Janine Bayes, and we've now just released our principles of ethical biomimicry finance. And basically what we are doing is licensing them to asset managers as a turnkey knowledge system. So as they begin having their clients, and the big pension funds too are beginning to realize, that they've got to divest from fossil fuels and all the rest of it, they're going to have to learn very, very quickly where to shift those assets. And we're saying that the destination is really going to be biomimicry and learning how to invest in companies that operate within nature's principles. So we have our first 3 licensees have already contracted, and so we are hoping that we can move into many asset management firms and get them to buy this knowledge that they need. This is good to get us into the black. We're not in the black yet. We are a social enterprise. And at the same time, we know that asset managers, if you don't charge them a lot of money for something, they won't think it's important. So basically, you can go on our website and look at those principles that govern the more detailed ethical biomimicry finance. And so I think I'm just about out of time now, so I just wanted to thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to getting into a discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hazel. Yes, we have just a little bit under half an hour, so we have quite some time for this Q&A. So please, I'm not sure if you all got the process. Please type in your question in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will put them together when needed or ask them for you. So, Hazel, there is one question going back to the idea of correcting GDP. So, could you just give us the very basics of how to correct GDP? What are these new measures? How do you integrate externalities?
Oh, thank you very much for that question, because I love to talk about this. The first thing is that we don't use the traditional economic method, macroeconomic method of weighting all of these various aspects and trying to aggregate them and come up with one single number. And so in many of our we have 12 indicators of quality of life, and a lot of them we use the appropriate metrics, which are not money coefficients at all. And so, for example, if you're trying to measure air pollution, you wouldn't use money. You would go to an atmospheric chemist, as we did, and say, okay, we need to know how many parts per million of junk there is in the air. And similarly, of course, with water pollution, we have an energy indicator, which is that got missed in economic theory because energy was subsumed in the models under capital. And so basically we look at energy GDP ratios and to what extent a country is wasting energy in its GDP. For example, the U.S. GDP is twice as energy intensive as that of Japan. So we have a human rights indicator, and there again, you wouldn't use money for that. And so several of our indicators use money coefficients. That would be the wealth and income indicators, of course. But many of them do not. So this was the basic methodological difference that our quality of life indicators had, and that was they were systemic, and they were also now I don't. Oh, there we are. I suddenly lost everything on my screen, but it's all come back now. So this is a systemic model, and it's multidisciplinary, and it uses many, many metrics beyond economics. So I hope that helps you understand why I couldn't give one figure for pollution, because there are many different aspects of pollution. And as you know, this is really one of the problems that's going on now with the Kyoto Protocol and the whole idea of focusing on carbon. And I wrote a lot about this in the Green Transition Scoreboard introduction that I do every time we update it. And that was, there's a lot of pollution related to fossil fuel use beyond carbon. And so now we're getting to a much more holistic measure of that, and realizing that what we really need is not a carbon tax, which the general public doesn't really understand what that is. What we need is pollution taxes, which the public does understand and very much in favor of, the same way that they're in favor of financial transaction taxes. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. And to stay on that topic, which you love, it is obviously central to this whole debate. Can you give us an update on the latest progress with that agenda at policy level, hopefully, and that's the end goal, but even in the current thinking, is that getting into business schools? Is that getting into the circles of discussions of policymakers?
Yes, I am amazed. I mean, I've been on this track for 35 years, and it was just amazing. I thought after the conference that I helped organize with the European Commission, which we had in the European Parliament in 2007, I thought, oh, for sure, this is going to be it. And there was a full house there, and everybody agreed, yes, we have to move forward. And still, it's taken another, 5-6 years for this to really surface. Now, why has this been such a taboo? Well, the first thing is that we have to look at mass media. And I helped organize a conference in Brazil in 2003, which we called the First International Conference for Implementing Quality of Life Indicators and Sustainability Indicators. And we had 700 statisticians from all over the world, and I wrote a little article which you can find on my website called Statisticians of the World Unite. And these were statisticians of health, education, poverty gaps, environment, and so on and so forth. And we had a teach-in for mass media. And we had the editors and reporters of all of the big newspapers in Brazil and Latin America and tried to explain to them about this GDP problem. And we realized that media has been a huge block because we don't have time to unpack it and say, what does it really mean? They're all in a hurry. It's kind of the conventional wisdom, and so it keeps on perpetuating itself. So that even after President Sarkozy and his commission introduced its critique of GDP back in 2000, I think it was 2008 or 2009, and Joseph Stiglitz said that GDP had become a fetish, whereas the dam seemed to break, I think, in 2012 after the Earth Summit and leading up to the Earth Summit. And I wrote an article about the Better Life Index, which OECD does, which actually uses the same methodology that we pioneered, really, in 2000, and that is a web-based approach with a dashboard of indicators. And as you know, their Better Life Index now is getting a lot of traction. Now, of course, one of the real leaders, which I have been involved with for a long time, was the Human Development Index that the UNDP put out first in, I guess, 1990. And that became a huge driver of the changing paradigm that we needed. And now what you see, we brought the people from Bhutan to Brazil in 2003 to present their gross national happiness index. And that turned out to be a bit of a double-edged sword, because the media people have then began to say, that this became the darling of the media. And when we did the conference in the European Parliament in 2007, the media said, we're not going to attend this unless you're going to talk about happiness. Well, as you know, there's a big debate about trying to measure happiness. It is very culturally determined, and it can have a really conservative, unintended consequence. And a lot of that discussion we had in the European Parliament, where economists were saying, well, okay, then let's just go with this happiness approach. And that means that basically it's subjective, and some cultures are kind of miserable and other cultures are kind of happy. And so maybe the government shouldn't really provide social services. Maybe it's just better to leave things alone. And so I became quite alarmed that could be the kind of outcome. You could measure very, very happy people, like they did actually in Bhutan, which is a Buddhist culture, and it's based on happiness. And there could be on the ground, some really awful conditions, and yet people might still be happy. And people might be very happy, for example, and being ignorant that they were sitting on water wells that were polluted with arsenic or something like that. So I think you always have to be sure that you have, some of the subjective data, which is collected through surveys, which is now an approach being used in Britain in their wellness studies, and the Happy Planet Index, which my friends at the New Economics Foundation do. But at the same time, you have to have it really pinned in the real world, and you have to measure actual outcomes as well. But the whole thing now, I think, is finally being addressed. As you know, at Rio, they released the Integrated Wealth Index, which is still too heavily economic in its approach, but a huge step forward. So I am thinking now that finally, we're going to be dealing with this one and coming to some sort of quality of life shift, which will be enormously helpful, because whenever you change the code and you change the game and you change the scorecard, you really are in the paradigm shift.
Absolutely. So if we look a little bit more micro and short term, we're talking to a lot of people, and a lot of us are trying to make a change at their own level, at their own scale. So as of today, what room is there for all the, to use your words, planetary citizen entrepreneurs within our current framework, which hasn't integrated this new economics yet? What room is there to develop successful businesses with this new with seeds of this new paradigm, but as of today in the current context?
Well, I think the first thing that all of us change agents and global citizens have to do is to keep making alliances across all sectors. And, for example, we are benefiting tremendously from the work that the Carbon Tracker group in London have been working on. And at the same time, that has been extremely helpful to Bill McKibben here in the U.S. with his 350.org campaign, where there's now 250 universities where students are demanding that the endowment of the university be made fossil-free. And we at Ethical Markets have a group of progressive asset managers that we love and work with. And some of them now are constructing very viable fossil-free portfolios. And this immediately feeds back to more and more companies being able to see a route to profitability if they decide to go all based on renewable resources. And I'm thinking of the Mosaic company in California, which is crowdfunding for local communities that want to put solar panels on their school or their community center. And those deals, thanks to crowdfunding, have gotten fully subscribed in a matter of 48 hours. And so this is why it's very important to stay close to the progressive people in the IT community, in the open source community. And we have a new page up on our website following crowdfunding. And all the crowdfunding news is really exciting because this is bypassing Wall Street and bypassing all those old security analysts who really do have to go back to school and learn, the principles of ethical biomimicry finance. And so the next thing we're doing to support those licensees who pick up our principles of ethical biomimicry finance is we're putting together case studies of biomimicry, ethical biomimicry compliant companies. And we have about 20 that we can showcase, and that research is ongoing now. It hasn't been released yet. And we're also putting together a network from our friends and associates of due diligence professionals who know how to look at these kind of deals and know whether the technology that they're using actually comports with ethical biomimicry principles. The ethical part is just as important as the biomimicry part, and there's a kind of a reason for that, and that is, to my surprise, I found that Wall Streeters and asset managers think they are already operating under life's principles. And I was a little surprised by that, but they say, well, yeah, this is Darwinian, right? It's red in tooth and claw, and it's the survival of the fittest, and we rip the other guy's face off. These traders have all of this colorful language when they're trading. And so I was saying, oh, my Lord, so how do we make sure that people understand that biomimicry principles are not to do with that which was a misreading of Charles Darwin? And I'm part of a group of scientists. You can find us at thedarwinproject.com. And this was going back to Darwin's original notebooks and realizing that Darwin was hijacked. And that the phrase, the survival of the fittest, didn't come from Darwin at all. It came from an editor of The Economist magazine. And so basically the whole idea of Darwinian and social Darwinism is a total misreading of Darwin and of actual life principles which are based on cooperation. And if we look at the way nature really functions, there's more cooperation going on all the time than there is competition, although both, of course, are very important. Are we still there?
Hello.
Yes. Hello?
Hi. Yes. Sorry, I was disconnected from the conference, so I had to dial back in.
Okay.
So sorry. So I missed the last part of what you were saying, Hazel.
About Charles Darwin and how it was hijacked by the elites in Victorian Britain.
Right.
Oh, yes. Okay. So I was just explaining that that's why we add ethical to biomimicry, to make it clear that we understand that that when we talk about life's principles and biomimicry, we don't mean the old misreading of Darwin, about the survival of the fittest and all of that, which turned out to be totally wrong. And what Darwin actually said was that the genius of human beings was in bonding and cooperating and sharing. And so that's why we make sure that we talk of the ethics as well as the biomimicry and life's principles, particularly now that we're in the era of the Anthropocene, right? And we humans are actually changing the entire planet, and so we have got to take responsibility for that.
Absolutely. And that's actually a good link to the next question. You mentioned that more and more people are living in cities. I think we're heading towards something like 70% of people living in big cities or mid-sized cities. At the same time, we know that we need to turn more to nature for solutions. So there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy or a challenge here. People are losing connection with more natural environments and living more in urban environments. And at the same time, we need to learn more from nature.
That's a very good point, and that this is why the biomimicry scientists that work with Janine Benyus and also those that work with my friend Bill McDonough in the work that he does, the cradle-to-cradle work that he does, cities are becoming the real frontier for redesigning according to biomimicry principles. And I know Bill has been working in China where they're creating ecologically designed cities from scratch. And I think that the opportunity really is that a lot of cities in developing countries can be more easily redesigned, that they don't have all these massive freeways and they're not all designed around the automobile to the extent that cities are in North America. So it is a big challenge, but the trade-offs really are that when people do congregate in cities, there are huge advantages in energy and materials efficiency, and if it's done right, it leaves land more available for agriculture. And as you know, the cutting edge of urban design is about vertical farms and all of the kind of green rooftops, the kinds of things that are trying to address the issue of cities. And as you know, there's a new group called C40, which is led by New York's Mayor Bloomberg, which is now about 60 cities, and they are very much looking at the whole redesign issue. And, of course, it's very hard. A lot of these cities are totally set in concrete. But even in the city of New York, they're beginning to retrofit buildings, making them greener. And I think that the whole movement to farmers markets in cities and these food deserts where children don't know where their food came from. Now, in New York, one of our associates that is called Hawthorne Valley Farms, which is a biodynamic farm run by 167 people, just a little way north of New York City. They go into New York City every week and create a farmers market in several areas of the city so that people can not only get good food, but they have all kinds of programs where inner city kids can come and spend vacations working on their farm. So we do have to have new ways of reintroducing city children into understanding nature.
Right. If we move to, well, you just gave an example of a concrete new type of activity, new type of business with this biodynamic farm. Can you give us a couple other examples of social businesses that really stand out? And through this example, tell us if you think that these social companies can have an equal dual purpose of both social good and profit.
Well, we ourselves at Ethical Markets Media are a social enterprise, and we don't expect to ever maximize our profits, but we do hope to very shortly break even just based on the information and licensing our television shows and books and articles and stuff. Another, of course, is Biomimicry 3.8. And Biomimicry puts out the most wonderful education programs all over the world, and they are now developing their revenues from this model, and I am personally an angel investor in Biomimicry 3.8 and brought in the other investors. We don't, there again, ever expect to maximize our financial returns, but the amount of social good that Biomimicry 3.8 is doing is the return that we're really looking for. And so there are many other companies like that. For example, I'm an early investor in a company called Envision Solar. And that's a complete no-brainer. It's based in San Diego. And as you know, in the U.S., there are square miles of ugly parking lots that ought to be generating electricity. And so what Envision Solar does, they have created all of these very beautiful solar umbrellas which cover parking lots and allow people to plug in their electric car and then can be recharged while they're doing their shopping or whatever. And so they have contracts now with General Motors to put the solar umbrellas over the parking lots of their dealers. They have a contract with the U.S. Navy, and so those kind of companies, I think, are really an example of how a company can do well by doing good. And there are many others that we are putting together in this set of case studies. I mean, I would say Hawthorne Valley Farms is another. And what we are discovering is that scale is a very important issue, as my dear friend, the late D.F. Schumacher, always talked about in Small is Beautiful. And that is that nature really is very much about local and about fitting companies to place, an ecosystem, and not about scaling things in a material sense worldwide, but rather the information. And this is really has always been my view of world trade. And I have a paper that I developed for a group in Brazil on what would sustainable world trade look like. Well, what it would look like is not shipping around stuff, but it would be rather, as Keynes said in one of his books, it's much better to ship around the recipe than it is to ship around the cakes and cookies and biscuits. And so basically that's what world trade needs to be dematerialized in the way that Janine is doing that with biomimicry. In fact, Janine and I, one of the reasons we got together is that our companies are so similar, that neither of us grow in the material sense. Janine still works off her little in her little farmhouse in the northern part of the U.S., and we still operate like many internet companies in the big garage of our house. And we don't grow because we think that's what cancer cells do. We replicate. we replicate our DNA, our cultural DNA, and our revenue model is licensing. And so this is how Biomimicry 3.8 is growing. Their current revenues are about 1.5 million a year. Ours are less than that. But basically, it's not necessary to grow immaterially. And this is a new kind of what you might call micro multinational.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's all about a completely change of business models as well. That's it's great food for thought, Hazel. Thank you very much for your presentation, for your time, for your stories, and for all this new thinking you bring in. It was absolutely great to have you for this webinar, which is our closing webinar of this series. So this, if I can change the slide, this is what's next. So for some of us in the Northern Hemisphere, it's going to be the summer break. We're definitely, our team, taking a bit of time off this summer. For some other people, from some other places around the world, it's a winter break or maybe no break at all. Anyway, good luck to everyone. Thanks a lot again to 2 Degrees for hosting this webinar. Thanks a lot to Hazel for your time. Thank you all for attending. Thanks, Hazel. Have a good day, everyone.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.